हेलो फ्रेंड्स, केजी क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम आपको फ्रांसिस बेकन का लाइफ बताएंगे। लाइफ ऑफ लॉर्ड फ्रांसिस बेकन 1561 to 1626। वर्थ एंड अर्ली ट्रेनिंग। फ्रांसिस बेकन afterwards created Lord Verulam and subsequently Viscount St. Albans, was the youngest son by a second marriage of the Lord Keeper Sir Nicholas Bacon, one of the Queen Elizabeth's favourite ministers. His mother was a woman of unusual ability, of strong characters, and a decided Protestant. Her elder sister had married the great statesman Lord Burghley, who was thus Bacon's uncle. There were in the family 8 children in all, 6 by the first wife and 2 by the second. Francis and his brother Anthony, who was elder by 2 years. The mother's influence seems to have been paramount during his boyhood. Indeed, she continued supervising his health and household management even after he had entered upon public life. At Cambridge, the two brothers, Anthony and Francis, entered Trinity College, Cambridge in April 1573. When Francis was only 12 years old, Queen Elizabeth took much notice of him and used to call him playfully her young Lord Keeper. Once, when she asked him how old he was, Bacon promptly replied with the instinct of a born courtier, 2 years younger than your Majesty. Happy reason. The most paramount result of his life at Cambridge was his deep-rooted aversion to the barren disputations of the Aristotelian philosophy, then so much in vogue in all seats of learning, and his resolve to replace it by something better. In Paris, he left Cambridge with his brother in Christmas in 1575, and the two began to study law at Gray's Inn in London in the summer of 1576. In the following year, Francis was sent to join the English embassy in Paris under Sir Amyas Paulet, but his father's death in February 1579, before any provision had been made for his youngest son, compelled Bacon to return home and take seriously to law as a profession. Law and politics. Bacon had formed the rudimentary idea of his philosophical system when at Cambridge, and his mind was now full of what to him was a secret ambition. He felt himself called upon to do a life work just as did Milton and Wordsworth. What to prepare himself for that great work, he must need have a competence. Naturally, therefore, he turned to his uncle, the High Treasurer, Lord Burghley. However, jealous of his nephew's great abilities and fearing he might interfere with his son Robert's success, left him to make his fortune for himself. Bacon accordingly threw all his energies into the pursuit of law and political success in Parliament. He was called to the war in 1582 and became a Venture of Gray's Inn in 1586. In 1584, he became a member of Parliament for Malcolm Regis. In 1586 for Taunton, and in 1593 for Middlesex. The Earl of Essex, disappointed in his expectation from Lord Burghley, Bacon resolved to advance his interest through the Queen's favourite, the Earl of Essex. He seems to have really liked and admired his pardon, and he certainly was most lavish of praise and esteem for the Earl and his partitions. Essex, on his part, worked hard with the Queen to secure Bacon's advancement. He tried, but in vain, to obtain for him the appointment successively of Attorney General, of Solicitor General, and of the Master of the Rolls. After failing to secure him a rich wife, the widow of Sir Christopher Hatton, Essex finally presented him with a landed estate, which Bacon turned into money. Bacon in return gave his patron advice of the most worldly kind as to the best way of winning of the Queen's favour, and warned him against those faults of temper and policy which afterwards brought about his ruin. When the Earl was tried in June 1600 for his failure in putting down the Irish rebellion, Bacon took a subordinate part with the counsel for the prosecution in order, as he said, to take advantage of any opportunity of helping his patron's cause. But when in 1601 Essex was tried for high treason after his abortive attempt at rebellion, Bacon openly used all his personal knowledge of the Earl's affairs and his skill as a lawyer to secure a condemnation. He had repeatedly warned his patron, and now he easily persuaded himself to believe that private friendship ought not to stand in the way of public duty. He received as his reward 1,200 out of the fines levied on those implicated in the rebellion. This was the tragedy of Bacon's life from beginning to end. He had to play a double role to gain a secure competence which might enable him to devote all his energies to the great work of the world's intellectual salvation, which he alone of man could accomplish. That was an which he alone of man could accomplish. That was an unavoidable necessity. With that object before him, he humbled himself to the dust and employed his vast intellectual powers in every detail of the trade of a time server and a sycophant, the essays. What he never forgot his divinely appointed mission. When he was 25 years old, 1586, he had published a philosophical essay which, in the fervor of youthful enthusiasm, he entitled The Greatest Birth of Time. In his application to his uncle, he wrote, "I have taken all knowledge to be my province." And this was no empty boast. He worked hard all the time at collecting a treasury of literary lore in the shape of proverbs, quaint maxims, curious and telling phrases, which might furnish him both for speech or for writing. In 1597, he brought out the first edition of book which, perhaps beyond all others, has laid a sure foundation for his literary reputation. This was his essays, 10 in number. A second edition containing 38 essays was published in 1612, and a third, considerably enlarged and revised, in 1625. It must be remembered that Bacon uses the word essay in its etymological sense of an experimental trial. The style of these brief essays, in which every sentence was compact with thought and published in expression until it might run alone through the world as a magazine, had all the strength of euphemism without any of its weakness. The sentences were all such as needed ingenuity to write, but this was the rare ingenuity of wisdom, as each essay shrewdly discriminated contained a succession of wise thoughts exactly and beautifully expressed. Bacon under James I. Bacon remained without promotion during the rest of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Nor was he more successful during the early part of the reign of James I. He was, however, knighted and made a commissioner for the Union of Scotland and England. In spite of all the good work he did in difficult questions arising out of the Union, Bacon's claims for preferment were continually passed over. Not till June 1607 did he receive the appointment of Solicitor General in 1626. He married an alderman's daughter with a fortune. He had no children. The advancement of learning. In 1605, Bacon published his first nature work in English prose. The advancement of learning, which forms the groundwork of his Instauration Magna, or Great Reconstruction of Science. The advancement was dedicated to King James, who, however, took little notice of it. In sending a copy to his friend Sir T. Bodley, he frankly confessed that he had been false to his own mission. He had allowed worldly business to take up the energies that ought to have been consecrated to the investigation of truth. Though he was never really at home among his worldly ambitions, now in this book he returned to his true self. This sense of dwelling under compulsion in a world alien to his own spirit troubled him long. Bacon, in this letter and repeatedly afterwards, sums up in the Latin word of verse 5 of the 120th Psalm. Multum in cola fruit and amina me. My soul hath long dwelt among them that are enemies unto peace. His promotions. In the year 1608, the clerkship of the Star Chamber at last became vacant, and Bacon obtained the post that had been promised him 20 years earlier. In 1613, Edward Coke was promoted to the Chief Justiceship, and Bacon became Attorney General when the King's favourite Villiers became the all-powerful Duke of Buckingham. Bacon paid court to him with the utmost servility, and in a dispute which occurred between the common law courts and the chancery, he used his influence with the king and his subtlety as a lawyer to bring about the degradation and dismissal from office of his old rival Coke. 1616. In the same year, Bacon became Privy Councillor, and in March 1617, through Buckingham Goods Office, he was appointed Lord Keeper in 1618 he became Lord Chancellor and was raised to the peerage as Lord Verulam. A title taken from Verulamium, the Latin name of St. Albans, near which lay Bacon's estate of Gorhambe in 1621. He was created Viscount St. Albans. In his appointment as Lord Chancellor, he worked with unexampled assiduity and does not appear to have seriously misused his judicial powers. What he allowed himself to be influenced by Buckingham in cases that came before his court, and he fell in with the usual custom of receiving presents from suitors. Probably nothing would be not ever have been heard of this but for the fact that he had all along, from the prosecution of Essex to the degradation of Cork, made a number of bitter personal enemies. His fall and death. The House of Commons, led by Coke, first attempted to call Bacon to account for having pronounced judgments in favour of the legality of numerous monopolies by which Buckingham had enriched his followers. But the king interfered and refused to sanction the inquiry. The next accused him of having received bribes and set up a statement to the Lord for their judicial decision. Bacon attempted no defense, but threw himself on the mercy of his peers. He was sentenced in April 1621 to fine of 40,000 in imprisonment during the king's pleasure, and to banishment from parliament and the court. After a month he was released from the Tower and retired to his family estate in September. He received a pardon from the king, but in spite of all his efforts to obtain employment or favor at court, he was left unnoticed. In travelling near London, he caught cold and fever, and died on April 9, 1626. He was buried in St. Michael's Church, St. Albans. Second, the works of Bacon, a survey of Bacon's work. The larger but not the more important part is written in Latin, for he was firmly conceived of the more enduring value of classical tongues. He even had his essays turned into Latin, his chief Latin work, and that on which his fame as a philosopher largely rests. In the Novum Organum, this and the advancement of learning, the latter translated into Latin and much enlarged as De Augmentis Scientiarum were to form part of the Instauratio Magna, a great project never completed. The Augmentis, with its survey of the state of learning, was to be the first section. Next should follow the Novum Organum, showing the way in which new truths could be discovered by the indicative method, urging the necessity of going from particular things to those which are but one step more general, from those to other of still greater extent, and so on to such as are universal. The primary object of man is to acquire knowledge. But in the pursuit of knowledge he has to fight against four main predispositions of the human mind to error. These, after Plato's Republic, Bacon calls idols of the mind. He divides them into idols of the tribe, or errors due to our common human nature, idols of the tribe, or errors due to our own individuality, idol of the marketplace, or errors due to the fallacies inherent in language, and idols of the theater, or errors due to the current philosophies of the day. The object then of Bacon's research is to investigate a scientific method of destroying these idols. The analysis of these idols is one of the notable pieces in English literature. The advancement of learning. Though the history of philosophy and science is really outside the province of literary history, we can hardly neglect Bacon as a philosopher, especially seeing that of his English work. The Advancement of Learning 1605 is at once a great prose work and a contribution to his scientific scheme. In book first, he tells us that knowledge is to be reviewed as rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's state. He analyzes the sources from which the discredits of learning arise and goes on to expound the dignity and influence of learning. In book second, he analyzes the defect of places of learning and proceeds to survey learning in all its branches and to examine how far there is deficiency in each branch and subdivision of each branch. At the end of his says, thus have I made as it were a small globe of the intellectual world, as truly and faithfully as I could discover with a note and description of those parts which seems not fully accurate or not well converted by the labor of man. In other words, here he said had drawn a map for the guidance of the future. Scientists in their effort at discovery and consequent conquest. B. The essays. To Bacon has been given the credit of introducing the essay into English literature. It would be truer to say that he introduced the word in its literary sense into the English language, for the Baconian essay has every little resemblance to the modern essay, which Addison and Strauss were to popularize. Montaigne had published his first two books of essays in 1580. They were translated into English by John Florio in 1603, and it was from him that Bacon derived the word and he meant by it. As he says, certain brief notes set down rather significantly than curiously, that is, without literary care. His essays have thus no artistic form, being without beginning or ending, and consist in the main of oracular utterance interspersed with illustrated quotations and anecdotes strung together on a more or less thin thread of unity provided by the title. The essays fall roughly into four groups according to they deal with: first, man in his home; second, man in public life; third, politics; and fourth, abstract subjects. See History of Henry VI. Seventh, Bacon's rank as historian too is very high. There was hardly any really critical history, objective and possessing a sense of perspective. The medieval chronicles had been written in verse, They had tried to cover huge period of time. They had little sense of character and were unable to distinguish fact and fiction. Nor did the Renaissance at once produce any truer historical writing, with the chief exception of Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III, written about 1513 and not printed in full until 1557. Instead, this earlier kind of rambling gossip rather than history survived in Elizabethan time in works of Hollin's Chronicles 1578. Bacon wrote history